Hello class, I am Annie George, your facilitator for this course, Applied Epidemiology. In the previous class, we discussed definition and concepts in communicable disease epidemiology. We talked about what communicable disease is. We also discussed the terms, common terms used in communicable disease epidemiology. In this lesson, we will go further to discuss the general principles involved in the control and prevention of communicable diseases. What are those principles? What are those basic principles involved in control of communicable diseases? What are those characteristics, those things you look out for when you want to control communicable diseases? That is what we will be discussing today. I promise it's going to be an interesting class. So join me, get on board, and let's get to class. So, topic 8, general principles of the control of communicable diseases. That's what we'll be looking at in our last week of discussions on applied epidemiology of communicable and non-communicable diseases. At the end of this lesson, we should know understand what epidemiologic triangle is and its components and characteristics. We should be able to identify the control measures targets on chain of infection and understand those methods of transmission of communicable diseases and how to apply such knowledge in prevention and control of communicable diseases. So, epidemiologic triangle. What is epidemiologic triangle? It's simply a triad of three things, which is the triad of agent, host, and environment. These three things play a very key role in what we call the epidemiologic triangle: the agent, the host, and the environment. So this is what the triangle looks like, and the components of the triangle, like we said, makes up the triad of host, the agent, and the environment. So we'll be looking at an activity 1, in the next slide. Activity 1. What are the characteristics of these triangle components? So the components, which is host, the agent, and the environment. What are their components? What are their characteristics rather? The components of the triangle or the epidemiologic triad is the host, the agent, and the environment. So what are the characteristics of each of these components? So if you look at this slide closely, it's not so clear, but you could see the host, the environment, and the agent. So the host is basically the characteristics talks about the age of the host, the sex, the race, the genetic profile of the host, whether the person has had a previous disease, what is the immune status, what is the person's religion, the custom, the occupation, the marital status, family background, are all characteristics of the host. Then in the environment, you talk about the physical environment, the temperature, humidity, pollution, noise, and then you talk about the social environment, neighborhood, housing, or crowding, the water, milk, and food. Then the agent, of course, agent can be a biologic agent, like the bacteria, the viruses, the fungus. Then agent can also be a chemical agent, like poison, It can also be physical agent, it can be nutritional agent. However, for the purposes of this discussion on communicable diseases, we will focus on biologic agents. So let's look at those components one after the other. The host. Who is a host? A host is basically a simple or complex organism, whether man or animal, that is being infected by the infectious agent. A host can be primary or definitive host, like I said in our previous lecture. When the parasite attains its maturity or sexual stage in the host, such a host is a primary or definitive host. But when the parasite attains its larval stage or asexual stage in the host, such a host is a secondary or intermediate host. So, the second component of the triangle, the agent. Who is an agent? Like I said, the characteristics of the agent can be biologic agent, can be chemical agent and all that. But for the purposes of this discussion on communicable diseases, the agent here is a biologic agent, which is mainly microorganisms that are capable of producing infection or infectious disease in the host. So name it all bacteria, name it all viruses, name it all the protozoa and helminths and all the fungus that are capable of producing infection in the host. They are all called agents. Like the virus, the COVID-19 virus is an example of an agent. Salmonella typhi that causes typhoid fever is an example of an agent. So many other agents that are microorganisms or biologic agents. So the environment, we had discussed the environment before. So as environment as one of the components of the epidemiologic triangle are those external factors or conditions that affect organisms' life and development. Environment can be physical, it can be biological, it can be social environment. The physical environment is the air, the water, the temperature, radiation. They are all parts of transmission of communicable diseases. The biological environment, the plant and animal can transfer infection from one another or one to the other. And then the social environment, the family, the surroundings, the culture, other practices all play a role as an environmental factor leading up to communicable disease. So the control measures target on chain of infection. Chain of infection is just incorporating the transmission process into the components of the epidemiologic triangle, the agent, host, and the environment. The transmission process sits in between. The agent moves to the host through the environment. So that transmission process forms what they call the chain of infection. Now, methods of transmission of communicable diseases and control measures application. Now, when you look at the methods of transmission of communicable disease, whether it's direct method or the indirect method, you can use that to halt the transmission process. Now, let's look at direct contact method, like sexual intercourse, HIV, hepatitis B. That can be quelled, curtailing unprotected sex. HIV, hepatitis B and C and syphilis and gonorrhea, all the sexually transmitted diseases can be curtailed or prevented or controlled through protected sex. Abstinence or protected sex can help control that as a direct method or contact method of transmission of communicable diseases. Some dermatological infections, the skin infections you could get through touching or body contact, can also be avoided through body hygiene. Kissing and oral candida an oral infection with candidiasis can also be prevented by avoiding that. Other direct method like blood transfusion, on-screen blood products, can prevent the transmission of HIV, hepatitis B and C. Breastfeeding, infections like HIV that can be transmitted through breastfeeding can be avoided if a mother is HIV positive, a breastfeeding mother is HIV positive, or the person can take antiretroviral medication, as may be decided by the medical practitioners or clinicians to avoid transmission of HIV and other infections that can be transmitted through the breast milk. Transplacental infection of toxoplasmosis congenital malaria can be avoided through regular screening during antenatal care for women. Exposure to soil, water, compost, and all that can also be avoided for such infections that thrive in soils and damp areas or healthy areas. Droplets and other particles can also be avoided through protection, body hygiene, washing, sanitization, or constant washing of hands. This can also help to prevent some of those infections that you can get through direct method. In the next slide, we will have another activity. Activity 2, what are the indirect methods of the transmission of communicable diseases? So we've talked about direct method. What are the indirect methods of the transmission of communicable diseases? So indirect method of transmission of communicable diseases like vehicle-borne infections through food and water, proper food hygiene and water hygiene, can also prevent such infections. Avoidance of contaminated materials and objects. The vector-borne infections can be prevented through good sanitation, use of insecticide. The airborne, which is transmitted through the respiratory tract, can be avoided by the use of face masks, like in this era of COVID-19. So usually transmission through the hosts can also be halted through the chain of infection processes. Transmission through the host can be halted, and when you're doing that, you look at the mechanism of entry of the agent, like through the skin or mucous membrane, the oral cavity, respiratory tract, or parenteral transmission when you put an IV line, intravenous line, or cannulate someone. Usually when such infection enter, the extent of damage of such infectious agents in the person's or the host body is based on the host defenses. That is what determines the severity of the disease. So we can also vaccinate people and involve in healthy practices, improve on the social determinants or socioeconomic determinants of health, income, education, female education, employment, and all that. That can also help people to make healthy choices and prevent the transmission of communicable diseases. When you look at transmission through the environment, what is the quality and quantity of water that is supplied in the community or in the neighborhood? What is the level of the food hygiene? These are things that promote the transmission of infectious diseases or communicable diseases. So when you have good quality and quantity of water, good hygiene, designing houses appropriately to avoid overcrowding, proper sanitation, good sewage disposal, and all that will help in the prevention and control of communicable diseases. summary in what epidemiologic triangle is made up of, and their components and characteristics. We now know how to target measures of chain of infection and transmission of infection, and how to stop the spread. And we also learned how to apply these characteristics in the prevention and control of communicable diseases. Thank you for listening.